One single word concealed a terrifying truth. Welcome to Holmes Mystery. I am your host, Lucien Moreau. Comment where you're listening from below. I appreciate every message you leave. Let's begin. Holmes turned the volume over in his long fingers, holding it delicately as though it were some rare specimen whose slightest mishandling might destroy its value. I observed that his languor had entirely vanished. The keen light had sprung back into his eyes, and there was about him that subtle tension which I had learned to associate with the approach of an intellectual challenge worthy of his powers. "You have read the passage yourself, Mr. Lorimer?" asked Sherlock Holmes. "Half a dozen times, sir. I can scarcely believe it even now." "Then perhaps you will be so good as to read it aloud for us."
I find that the ear often detects what escapes the eye." The man nodded, though his hand shook visibly as he opened the book to its final page. The paper there was markedly fresher than the rest, the ink darker, as though the words had indeed been set down within hours of Sir Gideon's death. He cleared his throat and began, "If these words are read, then I am already beyond earthly aid. The hand that brings about my end is one I have long known, and I confess, long feared. Clara Lorimer, my niece, has at last resolved to act. Let it be known that I do not write in anger, but in certainty. The signs have been plain to me these past weeks. I forgive her, though the law must not. G.L." A silence followed, broken only by the faint hiss of the coals in the grate. "And your sister?" I asked gently. "What does she say to this accusation?" "Mr.?"
Lorimer shut the book with a snap. "She denies it absolutely. She was in the house at the time, it is true. But so was I, and yet—" He passed a hand over his brow. There was no sound, no disturbance. The servants heard nothing. The door was bolted from within when we forced it open. Holmes rose and paced slowly to the window, peering out into the yellow murk. "You forced the door, you say? At what hour?" "Shortly after 9 this morning." My uncle had not appeared for breakfast, which was unusual. We knocked, there was no reply. At last we broke it in, and the position of the body. Seated at his desk, his head had fallen forward upon his chest, as though he had simply fallen asleep. No marks, no odour, no trace of chemical agents. None that the local doctor could detect. Holmes turned back sharply. And yet this message—
Written what? Minutes? Hours before death, naming a specific individual? It is madness," cried Lorimer. "Or else—" He hesitated, his eyes darting between us. "Or else she has found some means beyond our understanding." "My dear sir," said Holmes dryly, "when a case appears to transcend understanding, it is usually because the understanding applied has been insufficient." He held out his hand. "May I?" Lorimer surrendered the book once more, and Holmes seated himself beneath the lamp, drawing it close so that the light fell full upon the page. I could see his lips moving slightly as he reread the passage, his gaze flicking from line to line with extraordinary rapidity. "You observe, Watson?" he said, suddenly, without looking up. I leaned forward. "The handwriting is firm, deliberate."
There is no sign of distress or weakening. Precisely. A man anticipating imminent death rarely writes with such composure unless he has reconciled himself to the event, or believes it unavoidable. "Then you think Sir Gideon expected to be killed?" "I think," said Holmes, tapping the page lightly, "that Sir Gideon wished us to believe that he expected to be killed." Mr. Lorimer started. "You mean—" "That we must not accept this document at face value. It is, at the very least, a performance." "A performance?" the man repeated. "But why would he accuse his own niece?" Holmes closed the book and steepled his fingers. That, Mr. Lorimer, is precisely the question which must occupy us. Motive, as ever, lies at the heart of the matter. Tell me, what is the relationship between your uncle and Miss Clara? The man hesitated.
Has been strained of late. She stands to inherit a considerable portion of his estate, though there have been disagreements regarding her conduct. My uncle was a severe man. And you? I also inherit, but less. I have never been in dispute with him. Holmes gave a faint smile. Few men, I imagine, would volunteer the existence of disputes if they had them. Lorimer flushed. I assure you of nothing, Holmes interrupted calmly. I merely note possibilities. Now, as to this locked room, did your uncle habitually secure himself in such a manner? Always. He was most particular. The windows were latched, the door bolted. He trusted no one. An admirable precaution, murmured Holmes, though it has a way of complicating matters after the fact. He rose again, his energy now unmistakable. Watson.
We must visit Blackthorn House without delay. There are details here which no second-hand account can adequately convey. Tonight? I asked, glancing toward the impenetrable fog. Especially tonight. The sooner we examine the scene, the less opportunity there will be for the truth to fade beneath the tread of well-meaning but clumsy feet. Mr. Lorimer sprang up. Then you will take the case? Holmes took up his coat and hat with a decisive motion. My dear sir, I took it the moment you uttered the words "the last page." A man who writes his own ending invites contradiction, and I have made something of a profession of contradicting such men. As we descended the stairs into the chill and gloom of Baker Street, I could not shake a curious impression that somewhere, hidden within that single page of ink, lay not merely an accusation, but a design, and that we were already, though scarcely aware of it, moving precisely as its author intended. The cab wheels moved with a muffled grind through the dense fog, the driver proceeding at such a cautious pace that it seemed we advanced more by instinct than by sight. Sherlock Holmes sat opposite me, his long frame rigid, his chin sunk upon his breast, and his eyes closed. Yet I knew from experience that this stillness was but the outward sign of intense mental activity. You have formed some theory already, said I at last. A framework, Watson, nothing more, he replied without opening his eyes. We possess at present 3 facts of interest. First, a man dies in a locked room without visible cause. Second, he leaves behind a written accusation naming his niece. Third, the document itself bears signs of deliberation rather than desperation. These facts are not in harmony. Therefore, one or more must be misleading. And the locked room? I asked. Surely that limits the possibilities. On the contrary, said he, opening his eyes now and fixing me with a keen glance, it expands them. A locked room is a declaration. It tells us not that entry was impossible, but that we are meant to believe it so. It is, in essence, a statement made by the scene itself. Then you suspect it has been contrived? I suspect nothing. I observe that it may have been contrived. Suspicion is a luxury we cannot yet afford. Before I could press him further, the cab drew up sharply, and the driver's voice reached us faintly through the fog. Blackthorn House, sir. We alighted before a tall, sombre residence, to its dark facade looming indistinctly through the yellow haze. A single lamp burned above the entrance, casting a weak halo of light upon the steps. Mr. Lorimer led us quickly inside, where the air was heavy with the subdued agitation of a household thrown into disorder. A gaunt butler received us, his manner composed yet strained. "This way, gentlemen," said he. "Inspector Lestrade is already here." Holmes raised an eyebrow almost imperceptibly at the name, and I could not suppress a faint smile. Our acquaintance with Inspector Lestrade had often placed us in curious opposition, though never without mutual respect. We were shown into a spacious study lined with dark wood and crowded with books. At its centre stood a large writing desk, upon which a shaded lamp still burned. Near it, with an air of quiet importance, stood Lestrade himself. "Ah, Mr. Holmes," said he, with a brisk nod, "I thought this case might draw you out." "It has that quality," Holmes returned. "You have examined the scene?" "Thoroughly, and I can tell you it's as clean a case as one could wish for." "Indeed?" Holmes glanced about him. "That is rarely a recommendation." Lestrade frowned slightly, but continued. "The old gentleman was alone. Door bolted from inside, windows secured. No marks of violence. But we have the written confession. Well, accusation. And the motive is plain enough. The young lady stands to gain, and there's been tension in the household." Holmes moved past him without reply and approached the desk. He bent over it, his keen eyes travelling swiftly across its surface, noting, as I knew, 100 details invisible to the ordinary observer. "And the body?" he asked. "Removed an hour ago, the doctor could find no immediate cause of death, though he suspects some form of poison not easily detected." Holmes nodded absently. "And Miss Clara?" "In her room. Quite composed, I must say, perhaps a trifle too composed." "May we see the room as it was found?" "Certainly." Lestrade led the way to the heavy oak door at the far end of the study. The broken lock bore clear evidence of having been forced, and the wood was splintered inward. "As you see," said Lestrade, "it was secured from within." Holmes knelt and examined the fragments closely, running his fingers along the jagged edges. "Yes," he murmured. "Forced from the outside, unquestionably. But the condition of the bolt before the act, that is another matter." Lestrade gave a short laugh. "The bolt was shot. Oh, we saw it ourselves when the door gave way." Holmes rose, but made no immediate reply. Instead, he crossed to the windows, testing each latch with delicate precision. All were fastened firmly. "No sign of tampering," said Lestrade. "No obvious sign," Holmes corrected. He then returned to the desk and seated himself in the chair which had so recently been occupied by the deceased. For several moments he remained perfectly still, his gaze fixed upon the blotter before him. "Watson," said he suddenly, "stand where the body was found." I obeyed, placing myself, as Lorimer had described, beside the desk, leaning slightly forward. "Now," said Holmes, "observe what I observe." "I see only the desk," I admitted, "and the lamp." "And beyond?" "The door. The windows. Nothing remarkable." Holmes smiled faintly. "Precisely. Nothing remarkable."
And yet a man, knowing death to be imminent, chooses this position, this posture, this final act of writing. Why here, Watson? Why not at leisure earlier in the day? Why not summon assistance? Because he believed himself in immediate danger, I suggested, or because he wished to create that impression, Holmes returned. At that moment there came a soft knock, and the butler reappeared. "Miss Clara Lorimer is prepared to see you, gentlemen." Holmes rose at once, his expression sharpening. "Then we shall not keep her waiting," said he, "for it seems to me, Watson, that the living may yet prove more instructive than the dead." We followed the butler along a dimly lit corridor, the thick carpets deadening our steps so that the house seemed unnaturally still, as though it too were holding its breath. I glanced once at Holmes,
But his face betrayed nothing. His eyes, however, had taken on that distant inward look which I had come to associate with the swift assembling of facts into some coherent whole. Miss Clara Lorimer received us in a small sitting-room at the rear of the house. A single lamp stood upon a side table, casting a soft light that fell upon her figure as she rose to greet us. She was a woman of perhaps 28, of striking appearance, with dark hair drawn simply back and a countenance remarkable less for beauty than for its composure. Indeed, it was that very composure which impressed me most, for though her uncle lay dead within the house, and a grave accusation hung over her, she stood before us with a calmness bordering upon the unnatural. "You are Mr. Holmes?" said she, addressing Sherlock Holmes directly. "I have heard of your methods. I trust you will employ them with fairness." "Madam," said Holmes, inclining his head slightly, "fairness is but another word for accuracy. If the truth lies in your favour, you may rely upon me to find it." She regarded him steadily. "And if it does not, then I shall find that also." There was the faintest tightening of her lips at this, though her voice remained level. "Very well. Pray ask what you wish." Holmes seated himself opposite her, while I took a position somewhat to one side, from which I might observe both speaker and listener. "You are aware, Miss Lorimer," he began, "of the contents of your uncle's final written statement?" "I am." "And you deny its truth?" "Entirely." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Then we must consider the alternatives. Either your uncle was mistaken, or he was deceived, or he intended to deceive others. Which of these seems most consistent with your knowledge of his character?" "My uncle," she replied, "was not a man prone to error. Nor was he easily deceived. As for deceiving others—" She hesitated for the first time. "He was capable of severity, even of cruelty, but not of falsehood in so grave a matter." "Yet you maintain that he was wrong." "I maintain," said she with a trace of emphasis, "that he could not have been right." Holmes watched her closely. "That is a subtle distinction. You speak not of his judgment, but of the impossibility of the act." "Because I did not kill him." "Where were you this morning between 8 and 9 o'clock?" "In the morning room. I was writing letters." "Alone?" "Yes." "No servant can confirm your presence?" "No." Holmes inclined his head slightly, as though acknowledging the difficulty of her position. "And your brother?" "In the library. He came to me shortly before 9 to say that my uncle had not appeared." Holmes rose and began to pace slowly about the room. "You and your uncle? There had been disagreements?" "Yes." "Of what nature?" "He disapproved of my associations, my independence. He believed a woman should submit to the direction of her family. I did not." "And this led to tension?" "To estrangement." "Did he ever threaten to alter his will?" Miss Lorimer's eyes flashed. "He did more than threaten it. He told me plainly that unless I conformed to his wishes, I should be left with nothing." "And yet," said Holmes quietly, "he dies leaving behind a document which ensures that you receive not merely nothing, but suspicion and disgrace." She rose abruptly, her composure shaken at last. "Do you think I do not see that? Do you think I have not asked myself why he would do such a thing?" Holmes stopped before her. "That, Miss Lorimer, is precisely what I wish to determine." There was a pause, during which she seemed to struggle with some internal conflict. At last she spoke again, more slowly. "There is something which may bear upon the matter. I had not thought it significant, but now—" She looked from Holmes to myself, and back again. For the past fortnight my uncle had been receiving letters. He would not say from whom, but they disturbed him greatly. I saw him reading one only yesterday. His hand trembled, and he locked it away at once. Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Did you see the handwriting?" "No." "The envelope?" "Only that it was plain, no crest, I know, Mark. And these letters ceased? I do not know. He kept them from me. Holmes resumed his pacing more rapidly now. Did he speak of them? Make any remark which might indicate their nature? Only once. He said— She paused, as though recalling the words with difficulty. He said that the past has a way of writing its own ending. Holmes stopped dead. Ah, said he softly. Did he, indeed? There was something in his tone which caused me to look at him sharply. His face, though composed, bore that peculiar expression of inward excitement which I had seen but rarely, and only when some vital clue had presented itself. Miss Lorimer, he continued, one final question. When your uncle wrote in his book this final entry, did you observe him at any point during the morning? No, or I did not see him after dinner last night. Nor hear anything from his study? Nothing. Holmes bowed. Then I thank you for your candour. You have been of considerable assistance. As we withdrew, I could not resist a glance back at her. She had resumed her seat, but the calm mask had slipped. Her hands were clasped tightly together, and her gaze was fixed upon the lamp with an intensity that spoke of thoughts far from tranquil. In the corridor, I turned at once to Holmes. Well? He smiled faintly. Our case advances, Watson, though not perhaps in the direction our friend Lestrade imagines. We have now a new element, the letters, the disturbance they occasioned. Ah, and that most suggestive phrase regarding the past and its ending. You think they are connected with the accusation? I do more than think it. I consider it highly probable. But the question remains, who was writing them and to what end? And the locked room? Holmes gave a soft chuckle. My dear Watson, when a man speaks of endings before his time, we must look not only at how he died, but at how he chose to conclude his story. And I begin to suspect that Sir Gideon Lorimer was a most deliberate author. Holmes did not at once return to the study, but instead moved slowly along the corridor, his head bent and his hands clasped behind his back. I had learned not to interrupt him in such moments, for his mind, once engaged, pursued its course with a relentless precision which even the smallest distraction might disturb. And at length he paused before a narrow table upon which stood a tray of correspondence. You observe, Watson, said Sherlock Holmes, that even in a house presently under strain, habits persist. Letters are received, sorted, and placed as they always have been. Routine is the enemy of concealment. He turned to the butler, who had followed us at a discreet distance. These letters, are they today's post? Yes, sir, they arrived shortly after 8. And Sir Gideon's correspondence, where was that usually kept? In his study, sir. He would take it in himself each morning. Holmes nodded. Then it is likely that among the papers already examined there may be traces of these recent communications Miss Lorimer described. We retraced our steps to the study, where Inspector Lestrade stood with an air of patient endurance, as though awaiting the inevitable complication which Holmes's presence so often introduced. Well, said Lestrade, has the young lady confessed? Holmes smiled faintly. On the contrary, she has introduced us to a fresh difficulty. Indeed? I should have thought we had quite enough of those already. Difficulties, my dear Lestrade, are merely opportunities in disguise. Holmes moved at once to the desk and began to examine the drawers with swift, deft movements. Papers were lifted, glanced at, and replaced with an orderliness that contrasted curiously with the apparent haste of his search. You have already inspected these? He asked. Every scrap, said Lestrade. There's nothing there but accounts, letters of business,
and the usual private memoranda. Nothing of a more personal or confidential nature. Nothing that would bear upon the case. Holmes gave a soft murmur, but made no comment. Instead, he drew open a lower drawer which had thus far escaped his attention. It resisted slightly as though something within obstructed its movement. "Ah," said he quietly, "we have here a minor irregularity." Lestrade stepped forward. "That drawer was empty." "Was it?" Holmes applied a little more pressure, and the drawer slid open with a faint jerk. Within lay a single sheet of paper, folded once upon itself. "I must have overlooked it," said Lestrade with some irritation. "An oversight easily made," Holmes returned smoothly, "especially when the object in question has been so placed as to discourage discovery." He unfolded the paper and held it to the light.
And I saw at once that it was a letter written in a bold, somewhat angular hand. Holmes read it silently, his expression growing more intent with each line. At last he passed it to me. "Read that, Watson." It ran as follows: "You cannot escape it. What was begun must end. The truth has waited long enough, and I shall see it written at last. You know what you did, and so do I. Do not imagine that time has buried it. I shall return tomorrow. There was no signature." "This is one of the letters Miss Lorimer mentioned," I said. "Undoubtedly." Lestrade gave a short laugh. "A threat, no doubt, but it proves nothing. Old men with guilty consciences often imagine themselves pursued." Holmes took the letter back and examined it closely. "Perhaps. But this old man did not imagine himself pursued. He documented it. And more than that—"
"Aye," he responded. "Responded? How?" Holmes tapped the desk lightly. "By writing his final entry. Consider the sequence, Watson. A letter arrives, this letter, or one very like it, announcing a return tomorrow. The following morning, Sir Gideon is found dead, having written that his niece is responsible. And you think the two are connected?" "I think it inconceivable that they are not." Lestrade folded his arms. "Then the writer of the letter is our man." "Or our woman," Holmes corrected gently. "Or neither?" "Come now, Holmes, you cannot have it every way." "No," said Holmes, "but I can insist upon clarity. We have here an individual who claims knowledge of some past act committed by Sir Gideon. An act serious enough to inspire both fear and anticipation. This individual promises to return. Shortly thereafter, Sir Gideon dies, perhaps leaving behind an accusation which directs suspicion elsewhere. The question is not merely who killed him, but why he chose to name Miss Lorimer." "And your answer?" Holmes smiled slightly. "I have not yet reached it." He turned once more to the desk and examined the surface with renewed attention. His fingers traced the edge of the blotter, lifted a pen, and tested its nib. "Fresh ink," he murmured. "Used recently, but not necessarily at the moment of death." "You mean he may have written the entry earlier?" I asked. "Precisely." Lestrade shook his head. "That makes no difference. Whether he wrote it at 8 or at 9, the accusation stands." Holmes looked up sharply. "On the contrary, it makes all the difference in the world. If the entry was written in anticipation rather than in extremis, then it becomes not a dying declaration,
but a calculated statement. And to what end? Holmes replaced the pen with care. To control the narrative of his own death. There was a silence, during which the implications of this idea seemed to settle upon us all. "You are suggesting," said Lestrade slowly, "that the old gentleman arranged matters so as to cast suspicion upon his niece, even if she were innocent?" "I am suggesting," said Holmes, "that we must consider that possibility." "And why would he do such a thing?" Holmes glanced once more at the letter in his hand. Because, my dear Lestrade, he feared something or someone far more than he feared the consequences of such an accusation, and when a man begins to fear in that manner, he is capable of the most extraordinary precautions. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his pocket.
We must learn more of Sir Gideon's past. Whatever this truth may be, it has waited long enough to kill him, and I have no doubt whatsoever that it has not yet done with us. Holmes remained standing by the desk for some moments after he had spoken, his gaze resting not upon any single object, but rather drifting across the room as though assembling its elements into some invisible pattern. I had seen that look before. It signified not uncertainty, but selection, the narrowing of possibilities toward a single, decisive line of inquiry. At what hour was this letter discovered? He asked at last, holding up the unsigned note. Lestrade consulted his notebook. Shortly after we entered. It must have been delivered yesterday, though the servants could not say precisely when. And no envelope? None. Holmes turned to the butler.
And you say Sir Gideon received his letters personally? Yes, sir. He would not permit anyone else to handle them. And yet this one lies concealed in a drawer, partially obstructed. That suggests it was not meant to be easily found. Curious. It may have slipped there by chance, said Lestrade. Holmes cast him a glance of mild amusement. Chance, my dear Lestrade, is a most convenient explanation, particularly when one has no better. He moved once more about the room, his attention now fixed upon the carpet, the hearth, and the spaces between furniture, rather than the objects themselves. "Watson," said he suddenly, "did you observe anything in Miss Lorimer's manner which struck you as inconsistent? She was composed, perhaps excessively so, but not, I think, insincere. Just so, composure may be natural, or it may be cultivated, and the distinction is subtle, but not beyond detection. And which do you incline toward?" Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he knelt beside the chair in which Sir Gideon had been found and examined its legs and casters with minute care. "At present," he said at last, "I incline toward withholding inclination." Lestrade gave an impatient snort. "You'll forgive me, Holmes, but while you're withholding inclination, I must proceed with the evidence in hand. The niece had motive, opportunity, and now a direct accusation from the victim himself. That is sufficient to justify her arrest." Holmes rose smoothly to his feet. "Justify it, perhaps, but not explain it. And until we can explain the manner of death—"
Any arrest would be premature. The doctor has already suggested poison. A suggestion is not a conclusion. Lestrade's brows drew together. "Then what do you propose?" "I propose," said Sherlock Holmes calmly, "that we establish first and foremost whether Sir Gideon died by natural means, by his own hand, or by that of another. Until that question is resolved, all else is conjecture." He turned again to the desk and lifted the black leather volume which contained the fatal entry. "There is also the matter of timing. If this was written in anticipation, as I suspect, then the interval between its composition and his death becomes of critical importance." "You think he may have known the exact hour?" I asked, "or believe that he did?" Holmes opened the book and ran his finger lightly along the edge of the final page. "Observe, Watson."
"Not the dryness of the ink. It has set thoroughly, yet not so completely as to suggest great age. I should place its writing at several hours prior to discovery, possibly late last night. Then he wrote it before the letters promised tomorrow?" "Precisely." Lestrade shifted his stance. "That still leaves the niece." Holmes shook his head slightly. "No, Lestrade, it complicates her position rather than clarifies it. For if Sir Gideon anticipated his death, before the appointed time, then either he misunderstood the threat or he acted independently of it. Meaning that the cause of death may not lie in the letter's author at all. This notion appeared to trouble even the inspector's confidence. "You are suggesting there may be more than one party involved." "I am suggesting," Holmes replied, "or that we must not confine ourselves to a single hypothesis when the facts refuse to support it." At that moment there came a hurried step in the corridor, and the door opened to admit Mr. Edward Lorimer. His face, already pale, had taken on a look of acute agitation. "Mr. Holmes, Inspector, there is something you must see." Holmes turned sharply. "What is it?" "A servant, one of the footmen, has just reported that he saw a stranger near the grounds last night, a man lingering by the garden wall. At the time he thought nothing of it, but now—" Holmes's eyes brightened. "At what hour?" "Shortly after 11. "And this was not reported earlier?" "No, the fellow assumed it to be some passer-by. Only now, with all that has occurred—" Holmes seized his hat. "Come, Watson. We must speak with this man at once." Lestrade followed with a muttered exclamation. "If there's been an intruder, that alters matters." "Indeed it does," said Holmes, already striding toward the door. "Though whether it simplifies them is another question entirely." We were conducted to the rear of the house, where the footman, a young fellow of nervous aspect, awaited us in evident distress. "You saw someone near the wall?" Holmes began without preamble. "Yes, sir. A tall man, wrapped in a dark coat. He was standing quite still as though watching the house." "Did you see his face?" "No, sir. The fog was thick and he kept to the shadows." "Did he attempt to enter?" "Not that I saw, but when I approached he moved away very quickly." Holmes regarded him intently. "And you are certain of the hour?" "Just after 11, sir."
And I had gone out to secure the gate. Holmes nodded slowly. "Thank you. You have been most helpful." As the footman withdrew, Holmes turned to us, his expression now one of keen anticipation. "A visitor who does not enter, a threat which announces its return, and a death which precedes it. The sequence is irregular, Watson, distinctly irregular." "And what do you make of it?" I asked. Holmes' lips curved into a faint, thoughtful smile. "I make of it this, that someone has miscalculated. Whether it be the writer of the letter, the victim himself, or a third party entirely, I cannot yet say. But somewhere in this chain of events lies an error, and it is upon that error that the entire case will turn." Holmes remained silent for several moments after the footman had withdrawn.
His gaze fixed upon the dim outline of the garden wall beyond the window. The fog pressed close against the glass, rendering the outside world indistinct and uncertain, much like the chain of events we now sought to unravel. "At 11, he murmured at last. "A figure appears, lingers, and departs without making entry. Yet by morning Sir Gideon is dead, under circumstances suggesting preparation rather than surprise. It is not the presence of the stranger which interests me, Watson, but his restraint." "You think he chose not to act?" I asked. "Or found that he need not?" Lestrade shifted impatiently. "That sounds like speculation, Holmes." "It is speculation," replied Sherlock Holmes calmly, "but of a variety which invites verification. Let us examine the grounds." Without waiting further, he passed through the rear door and out into the garden, we following close behind. The chill air struck sharply after the closeness of the house, and the fog, though thinning slightly, still clung low over the lawn. A gravel path led toward the wall where the footman had seen the stranger, and Holmes moved along it with quick, deliberate steps. "Take care where you tread," he said over his shoulder, We are fortunate that the ground is soft from yesterday's rain. Indeed, as we approached the wall, I could discern faint impressions upon the damp earth, footprints, partially blurred, but still distinguishable. Holmes dropped at once to his knees. "Here we have our visitor," said he. "A man of some height, as the witness reported. Note the length of the stride and the depth of the impression." He paused here, near the wall, and remained stationary for some time. "How can you tell?" I asked. "The repeated compression of the same area," said Holmes, pointing. "The soil has been pressed more deeply in a confined space, indicating that he shifted his weight without moving position." Lestrade leaned forward. "And then he left?" Holmes followed the trail a few paces along the wall. "Yes, though not in haste, as our young friend suggested. The stride is even, the pressure consistent." He withdrew calmly. "That contradicts the footman's account," said I. "It refines it," Holmes corrected. "The man appeared to move quickly, perhaps because he was already in motion when observed. But these marks show no sign of sudden acceleration." He rose and brushed the damp earth from his hands. "Now, Watson, consider. Why should a man come to this place at that hour, merely to observe and then depart without action?" "To reconnoitre," I suggested. "Possibly, or to confirm something already known." Lestrade frowned. "You mean he knew what he would find?" Holmes nodded slightly. "Or what he would not find." There was a pause, during which the implications of this remark seemed to settle upon us all. "You think Sir Gideon was already dead?" I said slowly. "Or beyond assistance," Holmes replied. "At the very least, our visitor did not attempt entry. That is a fact we must reconcile with the rest." We returned to the house in silence, each absorbed in his own reflections. Upon re-entering the study, Holmes went directly to the desk and once more opened the black leather volume. "There is a curious symmetry here," he said. "A man writes of an impending end. A threat announces its return. A stranger appears,
yet does nothing, and the death itself occurs in a manner which leaves no immediate trace." Lestrade folded his arms. "You make it sound like a performance." Holmes glanced up sharply. "Exactly so. But to what audience?" Holmes tapped the page of the book. "To us, perhaps, or to someone else entirely." He closed the volume and turned to Mr. Lorimer, who had remained hovering anxiously near the door. "Your uncle, was he a man given to theatrical gestures?" The man hesitated. "He was deliberate. He liked to control situations, to arrange matters precisely as he wished, even to the point of deception. I would not say deception, but he valued effect." Holmes smiled faintly. "Effect, Mr. Lorimer, is often achieved through deception." He moved again to the fireplace and stood with his back to it, his eyes half closed.
"There is one aspect of this case which troubles me above all others," he continued. "The absence of a visible cause of death. Poison has been suggested, but no trace has yet been found. If poison was employed, it must have been of a subtle and unusual kind, one not easily detected by ordinary means." "Or else there was no poison," I said. Holmes opened his eyes. "Precisely, Watson. And if there was no poison, then we must consider alternatives." Lestrade gave a short laugh. "You are not suggesting the man died of fright?" "Not fright," said Holmes quietly, "but perhaps of anticipation." We all stared at him. "You mean he expected to die, and so he did?" I said incredulously. Holmes shook his head slightly. "Not in so crude a sense, but the mind exerts a powerful influence upon the body. A man convinced of his imminent death may succumb to causes which would otherwise be resisted." Lestrade looked unconvinced. "That is a medical question, and one which I shall leave in part to my colleague," said Holmes with a slight inclination toward me. But before we pursue that line, there is another matter which demands attention. He turned abruptly. The letters. We have one. But there must have been others. Where are they? Mr. Lorimer spread his hands helplessly. We have found none. Then they have been removed, said Holmes decisively. By whom? Holmes's gaze moved slowly from one face to another. That, gentlemen, is the question which will bring us considerably nearer to the truth, for whoever took those letters had knowledge of their importance and a reason to conceal them. He paused. Taken for a brief instant, I saw again that flicker of excitement which had first animated him upon hearing the case. And I begin to suspect, he added softly, that the removal of those letters may prove to be the most revealing act of all. Holmes's words lingered in the air with a weight that none of us could easily dismiss. The notion that the missing letters might hold greater significance than the death itself seemed at first almost paradoxical. Yet I had learned that when Sherlock Holmes placed emphasis upon an absence rather than a presence, it was rarely without cause. "You are certain there were more?" asked Inspector Lestrade, though his tone betrayed lingering scepticism. "Miss Lorimer's account was clear," Holmes replied. "A series of letters, each producing a marked effect upon Sir Gideon. It is inconceivable that he preserved only the most recent while destroying the rest, particularly when that last one is itself concealed." "Then someone else removed them," said Lestrade. "Exactly, and not without purpose." Mr. Lorimer stepped forward, visibly agitated. "You cannot mean one of us? Someone in the house?" Holmes regarded him thoughtfully. "The possibilities are limited, Mr. Lorimer. Either the letters were removed before Sir Gideon's death, or afterward. In the former case, only those with access to his private study could have taken them. In the latter, anyone entering after the door was forced would have had the opportunity." Lestrade gave a short nod. "My men were among the first inside. I'll answer for them." "As you will," said Holmes mildly. "But we must not exclude any avenue prematurely." He turned once more to the desk and ran his hand lightly along its surface, as though reacquainting himself with its dimensions. "There is another point which bears consideration. The drawer in which this letter was found was partially obstructed. It did not open freely. That suggests it was closed in haste, or with something caught within." "You think whoever hid the letter was interrupted?" I asked. "Possibly. Or that the act itself was not carefully executed. In either case, it contrasts with the otherwise deliberate arrangement of the scene." Lestrade frowned. "You keep returning to that arrangement. You're convinced the old man staged something?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Well, yes, let us say that I am convinced he intended his death to be interpreted in a particular way." "And you don't think that interpretation is correct?" "I think it is incomplete." There was a pause, during which Holmes appeared to weigh his next words with unusual care. "Watson," he said at last, "you will recall the position of the body, seated, composed, without sign of struggle." "Perfectly." "And the absence of any implement or vessel by which poison might have been administered?" "Yes." "Then consider this. If Sir Gideon did indeed take poison, whether by his own hand or another's, where is the means by which it was taken?" I felt a sudden chill. "You mean it should still be here?" "In the majority of cases, yes. Poison leaves traces, not merely within the body, but in the environment. A glass, a vial, a residue. Yet here we have none." Lestrade shifted uneasily. "It may have been removed." "By whom?" Holmes asked quietly. "The room was secured. The door was forced. Unless we are to assume some extraordinary mechanism, the removal must have occurred before the door was opened." "And that brings us back to the victim himself," I said. Holmes inclined his head. "Just so. Either Sir Gideon removed the evidence, or there was no such evidence to remove. Mr. Lorimer sank into a chair. "This grows more bewildering with every moment." "On the contrary," said Holmes, "it grows clearer. Each eliminated possibility brings us nearer to the truth." He moved toward the window and stood looking out into the fog-shrouded garden. "The visitor at 11 did not enter. The letters are missing." The final message was written in advance, and the death itself leaves no obvious trace. He turned suddenly. "Lestrade, I must ask, has anything been taken from the room since your arrival?" "Nothing," said the inspector firmly. "Everything has been left as it was found." "Except the body." "Except the body." Holmes nodded. "Then our next step is evident. We must examine Sir Gideon himself." "The doctor has already done so," Lestrade protested. "Then we must do so again," Holmes returned, "with a different purpose." He reached for his coat. "Watson, you will accompany me. Your medical expertise may prove invaluable." "Of course." Mr. Lorimer rose anxiously. "You believe there is something to be found?" Holmes paused at the door. "I believe," said he, "that if Sir Gideon Lorimer has left us a puzzle, he has also left us its solution. The difficulty lies not in its absence, but in its concealment." As we stepped once more into the corridor, I could not rid myself of a growing sense that the case was shifting beneath our feet. What had begun as a straightforward accusation now unfolded into something far more intricate, a design in which each element, whether present or missing, played a deliberate part, and somewhere within that design, hidden behind the calm words of a dying man, lay the truth, not only of how he died, but of why he had chosen to tell his story in such a singular and troubling way. The journey to the mortuary was conducted in near silence, broken only by the rhythmic rattle of the cab and the distant, muffled sounds of the city settling into night. Holmes sat forward this time, his earlier stillness replaced by a restless intensity. More than once I observed him take the folded letter from his pocket, glance at it briefly, and return it again, as though testing its place within the larger pattern forming in his mind. "You are unusually preoccupied," I ventured at last. "I am engaged, Watson," said Sherlock Holmes quietly, "in reconciling a contradiction. When a man arranges the circumstances of his own death so carefully, he does so for a reason. Yet that reason must align with the method employed, and here the method remains obscure." "You still incline toward the idea of self-administration?" "I incline toward nothing, but I cannot ignore the absence of any external agency within the room. If another party caused his death, they must have done so in a manner which left no trace and required no entry. That is not impossible, but it is improbable." "And the alternative?" "That Sir Gideon himself set the mechanism in motion." We drew up before a sombre building, its stone facade lit by a single gas lamp which flickered in the damp air. Lestrade was already there, having gone ahead to make the necessary arrangements. He greeted us with a curt nod. "The doctor is waiting," said Inspector Lestrade. "Though I'll tell you plainly, Holmes, he considers this a waste of time." "Medical men are often of that opinion," Holmes returned. "Until the moment, they are not." We were conducted into a narrow, whitewashed room where the body of Sir Gideon Lorimer lay upon a raised table covered with a sheet. The doctor, a grave and somewhat impatient gentleman, stood nearby. "I have already conducted a preliminary examination," said he.
There is no sign of violence, no obvious poison, no disease sufficient to account for sudden death. The heart shows some weakness, but nothing conclusive." Holmes inclined his head. "Then you will not object to our making a further inspection?" The doctor shrugged. "So long as it does not interfere with my work." Holmes turned to me. "Watson?" I stepped forward and drew back the sheet. The face of Sir Gideon was composed, almost serene, the features set in an expression of quiet finality rather than distress. I began my examination with all the care my training permitted, aware that Holmes watched not merely the body, but my own reactions to it. "The skin is unmarked," I said. "No discoloration about the lips or fingertips, no sign of convulsion. If poison was employed, it must have been of a very subtle nature." Holmes leaned closer. "The eyes, Watson." I examined them carefully. Pupils slightly contracted, but not unusually so. There's no indication of any of the more common toxins. "And the mouth?" I parted the lips gently. "No residue, no odour, nothing to suggest ingestion of any substance." Holmes straightened slowly. "Then we are confronted with a death without visible cause." The doctor gave a faint, impatient gesture. "As I have already stated." Holmes paid him no attention. Instead, he began a more minute inspection of the clothing, running his fingers along the seams, the cuffs, and the collar. "Observe this, Watson." He indicated a small, almost imperceptible mark upon the inside of the left cuff, a faint discoloration, scarcely more than a shadow. "What do you make of it?" I bent closer.
Or it might be a stain, perhaps from ink or some chemical, but it is too slight to identify with certainty. Holmes nodded. Too slight for certainty, but not for significance. Lestrade stepped nearer. "You've found something, then?" "I have found a question," Holmes replied, "and that is often the more valuable discovery." He turned again to the doctor. "You mentioned the heart showed some weakness. Would such a condition render the subject susceptible to sudden shock?" The doctor considered. "In certain circumstances, yes. A sufficiently strong stimulus, physical or emotional, might prove fatal." Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly. "Even in the absence of poison?" "Possibly." Holmes clasped his hands behind his back and began to pace slowly across the room. "Then let us suppose," he said, "that Sir Gideon anticipated such a shock. Indeed, it relied upon it. That he placed himself in a position where the expectation of death became, in itself, the cause." Lestrade frowned. "You mean he frightened himself to death?" Holmes stopped. "I mean," said he quietly, "that he may have arranged matters so that his own mind became the instrument of his destruction." There was a silence, broken only by the faint ticking of a clock somewhere beyond the walls. "But to what end?" I asked. Holmes turned toward me. "To create a death which appears to be murder, and to direct suspicion where he chooses." "And the letters?" said Lestrade. "Ah," Holmes murmured, "the letters. They provided the necessary anticipation, the sense of inevitability. But they also introduced another player into the game." He reached into his pocket and drew out the threatening note once more. Had this individual, whoever they may be, intended to confront Sir Gideon, yet, when they came, they did not enter. Why? Because the event they anticipated had already occurred, or because they recognized that their presence was no longer required. Lestrade shook his head. "You're building a very elaborate theory, Holmes." "Not elaborate," said Holmes, folding the letter again with care. "Merely consistent with the facts as we now possess them." He glanced once more at the still form upon the table. "Sir Gideon Lorimer has written his own ending, but he has not accounted for every reader, and it is in that oversight, I suspect, that we shall find the key to the entire affair." We stepped out once more into the cold night air, and I could not help but feel that the case, rather than resolving itself, it had deepened into something more subtle and disquieting. The idea that a man might orchestrate his own death, not merely as an act, but as a calculated narrative, lent the entire affair an almost philosophical complexity. Holmes, however, seemed invigorated rather than perplexed. His stride was brisk, his expression intent. "You perceive it now, Watson," said Sherlock Holmes. "I perceive that Sir Gideon's death may not be murder in the conventional sense," I replied. "But I do not yet see how it absolves Miss Lorimer, or implicates anyone else." Holmes gave a short nod. "Quite right. We have removed one layer of deception, but another remains. The accusation still stands, and it was placed deliberately. And the missing letters? Precisely. And they are the hinge upon which the case turns." We had not gone far when Holmes suddenly halted beneath a street lamp. "There is one inconsistency which we have not yet addressed," he said. "And that is?" "The behaviour of our visitor at 11 o'clock. The man by the garden wall. Just so, he comes, observes, and withdraws. Yet, if his purpose was to confront Sir Gideon, why does he not attempt entry? Why does he not return in the morning, as his letter suggests?" "Perhaps he feared detection," I suggested. Holmes shook his head. "No, the man who writes in such terms, 'I shall return tomorrow,' is not one to shrink from execution of his intent. There is, I think, another explanation." "And that?" "He discovered that his purpose had already been fulfilled." I stared at him. Then he knew Sir Gideon was dead? Or knew that the conditions he required no longer existed? Before I could respond, we were joined by Inspector Lestrade, who had followed close behind. "Well, Holmes," said he, "have you reached your conclusion yet?" "Not entirely," Holmes replied. "But I am near enough to justify a certain experiment." "An experiment?" Holmes smiled faintly. "A reconstruction, if you will. We must return to Blackthorn House." Lestrade raised an eyebrow. "At this hour?" "Especially at this hour." There was something in Holmes's tone which brooked no argument, and within the half-hour we found ourselves once more within the shadowed grounds of the Lorimer residence. The fog had lifted somewhat, leaving the garden clearer than before, though still dimly lit. Holmes moved directly to the study. "Mr. Lorimer," said he, "and as that gentleman met us in the hall, I must ask that we be permitted to recreate, as precisely as possible, the circumstances of your uncle's final hours." The man looked startled, but nodded. "If it will assist you, yes, of course." Holmes entered the study and at once took his former position behind the desk. He adjusted the lamp, drew the chair slightly forward, and opened the black leather volume to its final page. "Watson," said he, "stand again where the body was found." I complied, though I confess I did so with a certain unease, for the room seemed still to hold something of its former occupant's presence. "Now," Holmes continued, "let us consider the sequence. Sir Gideon writes his final entry, calmly, deliberately. He anticipates his death. He names his niece. He then remains seated, or awaiting the inevitable." "And the cause?" I asked. Holmes tapped the desk lightly. "That is the crux of the matter. If no external agent is present, then the cause must be internal, or triggered by something within the room." He rose suddenly and moved to the door, examining once more the broken lock and the bolt. "Secured from within, no entry, no exit." He then crossed swiftly to the window, testing the latch, also secure. Lestrade folded his arms. "We've been through all this." "Yes," said Holmes, "but not in its proper order." He turned abruptly to Mr. Lorimer. "When the door was forced, who entered first?" "I did, with the butler." "And what did you observe immediately?" "My uncle at the desk, nothing else." "No object out of place, no sound, no odour?" "None." Holmes nodded slowly, then returned to the desk. He leaned over it, had his eyes fixed upon the blotter, the pen, the arrangement of papers. "Watson," he said quietly. What is the one action which must occur between the writing of that final line and the moment of death? I considered. He must have set down the pen. Precisely. Holmes picked up the pen and held it lightly between his fingers. And yet, observe its position. It lies not where it would naturally fall, but aligned, placed. Then he arranged it after writing, I said. Or someone else did. Lestrade shook his head. Impossible. The room was locked. Holmes's eyes flashed. Exactly, Lestrade, and therefore the arrangement must have been made before the room was secured. A sudden stillness fell upon the room. You mean everything was set in advance? I said slowly. Holmes placed the pen back upon the desk with great care. I mean, said he, that Sir Gideon did not merely anticipate his death, he prepared the entire scene in which it would be discovered. And the accusation? Lestrade demanded. Holmes looked toward the door. That, I think, was the final and most deliberate stroke of all. He moved to the window and gazed out into the darkened garden. The visitor at 11 saw something which convinced him that the game was already decided. He did not need to act, because the conclusion had been written. Holmes turned back to us, his expression now one of quiet certainty. The only question that remains, gentlemen, is this. Who was the intended reader of that conclusion, and why did Sir Gideon wish them to see it so? For several moments after Holmes spoke, none of us ventured a reply, but the quiet certainty in his tone carried with it a weight that demanded reflection rather than interruption. At last, it was Inspector Lestrade who broke the silence. "You're suggesting," said he slowly, "that the message wasn't meant for us at all, but for this unknown correspondent?" Holmes inclined his head. "That is my present conclusion. Sir Gideon's final entry was not a spontaneous accusation. It was a communication, a signal, if you will, directed toward the author of those letters." "And naming Miss Lorimer was part of that signal?" I asked. "Exactly so, Watson. It is the most conspicuous element of the message, and therefore the most suspect." Mr. Lorimer, who had been standing near the door in evident agitation, stepped forward. "But why should he accuse Clara if she were innocent? What purpose could that serve?" Holmes turned toward him with a grave expression. "Because, Mr. Lorimer, the accusation was never intended to withstand scrutiny. It was meant to provoke a reaction." "A reaction? From whom?" Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he crossed again to the desk and opened the black leather volume, his finger resting lightly upon the final page. "Consider the wording," said Sherlock Holmes. "It is not merely an accusation, it is an assertion of certainty. The signs have been plain to me these past weeks." That phrase is crucial. It implies observation, interpretation, and perhaps misinterpretation. "You think he guessed wrong?" said Lestrade. "I think he wished someone to believe that he had guessed wrong." Holmes closed the book with a soft snap. "The letters accuse him of some past act, something concealed, something that has waited long enough. Sir Gideon, in response, constructs a narrative in which he himself becomes the victim of a different threat, one originating within his own household. In doing so, he creates a contradiction." "A contradiction?" I repeated. "Yes. If the writer of the letters knows the truth of Sir Gideon's past, then they will recognize the accusation against Miss Lorimer as false, or at least irrelevant. That recognition would compel them to act." Lestrade's eyes narrowed. "You mean to reveal themselves?" "Precisely." Mr. Lorimer gave a faint exclamation. "Then the accusation was bait?" Holmes smiled slightly. "An inelegant term, perhaps, but accurate." A long silence followed, during which the implications of this idea unfolded in my mind. "But Holmes," I said at last, "if Sir Gideon intended to draw out this person, he has done so at the cost of his own life." Holmes's expression grew more serious. "Yes, and that is the one element which suggests that his plan was not entirely successful." "Not successful?" Lestrade repeated. "The man is dead." "Exactly," said Holmes, "and yet the individual he sought to expose has not come forward, at least not openly." He moved once more to the window, gazing out into the garden where the faint outlines of the wall could just be discerned. "Except," he added softly, "for a figure who came in the night, observed, and withdrew." We all followed his glance. "You believe that was the correspondent?" I asked. "I consider it highly probable." "And he saw the message?" Holmes nodded. "Or enough of it to understand that Sir Gideon had taken a decisive step."
But instead of responding, he retreated. "Why?" said Lestrade. Holmes turned back, his eyes keen. "Because the situation had altered. Whatever he intended to do, he found it unnecessary or impossible." Mr. Lorrimer shook his head in bewilderment. "I cannot follow it. If this man threatened my uncle and then found him dead, why would he not come forward? Why not claim responsibility or at least explain himself?" Holmes regarded him steadily. "Because, Mr. Lorrimer, he is not the killer." The words fell with startling clarity. If he were, he would have no need to conceal himself further. His purpose would have been accomplished. The fact that he withdrew suggests that he found the outcome unexpected. "Then we are left with no murderer at all," said Lestrade. Holmes raised a finger. On the contrary, we are left with a death which may not be murder in the legal sense, but which has nonetheless been engineered. Sir Gideon set the stage, but someone else supplied the conditions." "The letters?" I said. "Exactly. They introduced the element of fear, the anticipation which, as we have seen, may have played a decisive role in his death." Holmes paused, then continued more slowly. "But there is still one matter unresolved. The letters have been removed. That act was deliberate, and it occurred after Sir Gideon's death." Lestrade's brow furrowed. "You're certain of that?" "I am. The concealment of the final letter was incomplete. The removal of the others was thorough. That indicates a difference in timing and in intention." "Then whoever took them knew what they contained," I said, "and wished to prevent us from knowing." Holmes turned toward the door. "Which brings us, gentlemen, to the final stage of our inquiry. We must determine who, among those present in this house, had both the opportunity and the motive to remove those letters, and, more importantly, to conceal the truth they revealed." He took up his hat and gloves with quiet decision. "For in those missing pages, Watson, lies the true ending of this case, and I have reason to believe that it is very different from the one Sir Gideon intended us to read." Holmes did not immediately act upon his declaration, but instead allowed a measured silence to settle over the room, as though giving each of us time to absorb the weight of his conclusion. Then, with that quiet decisiveness which I had so often admired, Sherlock Holmes turned toward Mr. Lorrimer.
"I must ask," said he, "that all members of the household be assembled here at once, yourself, your sister, the butler, and any servant who had access to this room after the door was forced." Mr. Lorrimer hesitated only a moment before bowing and withdrawing. Lestrade cast Holmes a searching glance. "You have it, then?" asked Inspector Lestrade. "I have the outline," Holmes replied. "The details will confirm themselves presently." Within a quarter of an hour we were gathered once more in the study. Miss Clara Lorrimer stood pale but composed, her brother beside her, restless and anxious. The butler and the footman lingered near the door, exchanging uneasy glances, Holmes remained standing by the desk, the black leather volume before him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we are concerned not merely with the death of Sir Gideon Lorimer, but with the interpretation of that death. The facts, as they first appeared, suggested murder, specifically that Miss Clara Lorimer was responsible. That conclusion, however, rests entirely upon a document which we now know to have been written in advance." He opened the book and tapped the final page. This was not a dying declaration. It was a calculated statement, composed to be read after the fact and to direct suspicion in a particular direction. Miss Lorimer's lips parted slightly, but she remained silent. "Why would Sir Gideon do such a thing?" Holmes continued. "Because he was under threat. The letters he received made that clear. They referred to a past act, something concealed, something capable of ruin. Sir Gideon, fearing exposure, chose not merely to defend himself, but to control the narrative of his own end." "Mr. Lorimer stepped forward. "Then you believe he took his own life?" Holmes inclined his head slightly. "I believe that he set in motion the conditions which led to his death. Whether by physical means or by the strain imposed upon an already weakened heart, the result was the same. He anticipated the moment and arranged for it." Lestrade frowned. "And the stranger at the wall?" "A witness," said Holmes, "or rather the author of the letters. He came expecting confrontation, perhaps confession, but found instead that the matter had already reached its conclusion. Recognizing that the situation no longer served his purpose, he withdrew." "And the missing letters?" I asked. Holmes's gaze shifted slowly across the room. "Ah, yes, the missing letters. They are the final piece, the one element which Sir Gideon did not control." There was a perceptible tightening among those present. "Those letters," Holmes continued, "contained the truth of Sir Gideon's past. Their removal was not an act of concealment for his benefit, but for the benefit of another, someone who feared that their contents, if discovered, would reveal more than Sir Gideon's guilt." His eyes came to rest upon Mr. Edward Lorimer. "You, sir?" A sharp intake of breath broke from Clara. "My brother," she said. Mr. Lorimer's face had gone ashen. "This is absurd." "On the contrary," Holmes said calmly, "it is entirely consistent. You had access to the room after the door was forced. You had the opportunity to remove the letters, and you had the strongest motive of all." "What motive?" Lestrade demanded. To Holmes's voice remained steady. "The motive of preservation. The letters did not merely accuse Sir Gideon, they implicated another. A partner, perhaps, in whatever act, lay hidden in the past." Mr. Lorimer's composure faltered. "You cannot prove—" "I can demonstrate," Holmes interrupted, "that the removal of the letters was selective and informed. You did not search blindly, you knew precisely what to take. That knowledge could only come from familiarity with their contents." He took a step closer. "You had read them before, had you not?" There was a long pause. Then, with a visible effort, Mr. Lorimer spoke. "Yes." Clara gave a low cry. "You told me nothing." "I could not," he said sharply. "You do not know what was in those letters, what he had done, what we had done." Holmes raised a hand. "Then you admit it?" "Mr." The Lorimer's shoulders sagged. "My uncle was not alone," he said hoarsely. "Years ago there was a financial matter, irregularities, funds diverted. I assisted him. I was young, foolish, but I was involved. When the letters came, I knew at once what they meant. Someone had discovered the truth." "And you removed them to prevent that truth from emerging," said Holmes. "Yes." Lestrade stepped forward. "That will suffice. You will come with me." Clara stood motionless, her face white as marble. "And my uncle?" she whispered. "He accused me, knowing I was innocent." Holmes' expression softened slightly. "He accused you," said he, "because he believed it would force the true adversary to reveal himself. In that he was mistaken. He underestimated the caution of the man he had wronged, and perhaps overestimated the loyalty of those closest to him. Mr. To Lorimer bowed his head. "I never meant for it to go so far." "No," said Holmes quietly, "but you ensured that it did." As Lestrade led him away, a heavy silence fell upon the room. At length Clara sank into a chair, her composure finally broken. Holmes closed the book and turned to me. "The case, Watson, is a curious example of a man who sought to write his own ending and failed to account for the edits of others." "And the truth?" I asked. Holmes gave a faint, reflective smile. "The truth was there from the beginning, but obscured by design. It is the simplest solutions which are most often concealed by complexity." As we stepped once more into the night, the fog had lifted entirely, leaving the street clear beneath the pale glow of the lamps. Holmes drew his coat about him. "A flawed narrative," he murmured, "is always betrayed by its inconsistencies. One has only to read it closely enough." And with that, he turned toward Baker Street, leaving behind a case whose ending, though written in advance, had revealed far more than its author ever intended.